The sound of hooves echoed through the dusty roads as Clara stumbled along the unforgiving trail, her swollen belly heavy with the weight of her unborn twins. The heat of the midday sun was unbearable, but it wasn't the sun that was threatening her life. It was the gang of outlaws hot on her heels. Her husband, Elias, a man whose hands were stained with the blood of those he killed, had dragged her into this nightmare. She had long since stopped asking questions about his past. Now, as they fled for their lives, it seemed as though his past was finally catching up with them. Clara had never imagined her life would lead her to this. A lone woman in the wilderness, racing toward an uncertain future, with the only thing she could count on being the newborns growing within her. But as she clutched her swollen belly and tried to keep up with Elias, she could hear the distinct sound of footsteps approaching from behind. They were closing in. The days had been brutal. The outlaws had ambushed their home in the dead of night, setting the house ablaze and forcing Elias to run with Clara in tow. She had begged him to stop, to turn back, but he had insisted. They had no choice. The gang was after him, after them, and only the trail ahead would offer them a sliver of hope. Suddenly they were trapped. A gunshot rang out, followed by another, and before she knew it, Clara was lying face down in the dirt, her body bruised, her heart broken. She could hear Elias's frantic voice screaming her name, but it faded into the distance. The gang had caught up with them. Clara was left for dead. As her body trembled, Clara's mind flashed to the twins inside her. Their lives were still in her hands. Desperate, she clutched her stomach, trying to hold onto them. She tried to push herself up, but the world spun, and then she felt the sharp sting of another shot. But this one wasn't meant for her. The sound of hooves returning. It was the Comanches. They arrived like shadows, sweeping Clara away before the outlaws had a chance to finish their work. In a haze, Clara was lifted and carried through the wilderness, her thoughts clouded with pain, confusion, and a creeping sense of dread. Her life, her children's lives, were now in the hands of strangers, and she had no idea what would come next. The journey ahead would change her forever. Clara was unaware of how much time had passed when she finally awoke. The world around her was unfamiliar. Smoky fires crackled in the distance. The scent of earth and leather filled her senses. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her body, causing her to collapse back down onto the ground. She felt weak, terrified, but then the voices hit her ears, rough, deep voices that spoke in a language she didn't understand. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the Comanche warriors surrounding her. She recognized their faces, sharp, intense eyes that watched her with an unsettling mix of curiosity and wariness. A figure stepped forward from the group. His face was hardened by time, and his eyes, dark and unyielding, bore into her with an unsettling calm. He wore the markings of a chief, Kawe. The Comanche warrior leader knelt beside her, studying her with the focus of a predator eyeing its prey. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen Comanches before, wild, untamed people who lived by their own rules, but never had she imagined she would become their captive. He reached toward her, gently but firmly lifting her hand and placing it over her heart. Clara flinched, but his touch was surprisingly soothing. "We do not kill those chosen by the Great Spirit," Kawe said quietly, though Clara barely understood him. She looked up at him, her vision blurry, but something about his presence seemed to ease her terror, even if just for a moment. Days passed as Clara's body healed. She was moved to a small shelter, isolated from the rest of the tribe. The warriors spoke little to her, but every now and then, a young woman named Awenita would bring her food, her hands trembling as she set the meal before Clara. She never spoke, but her eyes conveyed something, sympathy. One night, as Clara lay in a restless sleep, she felt a hand gently brush against her arm. It was Kawea again, standing over her with a solemn look on his face. He reached down and carefully examined one of the newborn twins, his fingers brushing against the baby's exposed skin. A mark, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Kawea froze, his expression hardening into one of awe and fear. He turned to the rest of the tribe, who had gathered around the campfire. The murmurs rose as they exchanged glances, sensing that something momentous had just occurred. Kawea's eyes met Clara's, filled with a mix of reverence and foreboding. "The Great Spirit has spoken," he said, his voice grave. "This child is destined for something greater than we can comprehend." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors, whispers of ancient prophecies in the small town she'd once lived in, but she never imagined her own child, her innocent, defenseless child, could be part of a fate tied to such things. Clara felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as Kawea's gaze lingered on the mark. There was no escape now, not from the Comanches and not from the destiny that seemed to be unfolding before her. Clara was no longer just a captive, she was a symbol. The tribe was preparing for something, a ceremonial gathering, a war. Clara couldn't decipher the conversations that swirled around her, but she could feel the weight of the tribe's expectations on her shoulders. They had spared her life for a reason, and now, her presence among them was part of their sacred ritual. It was impossible to know whether the spirits were guiding her or condemning her, but as she looked at her children, one, the marked twin, and the other, unmarked but no less precious, Clara made a silent promise to protect them no matter what. But as the days stretched on, the ghosts of her past haunted her. Elias was gone, the outlaws were still out there, and the wilderness, with its dangers and promises of vengeance, would demand its price. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, but deep inside, Clara knew this was only the beginning. The fire crackled as Clara lay in her tent, staring up at the stars above, the weight of her uncertain future pressing down on her. Would the Comanches release her once the ceremony was over? Would they let her go with her children? Or was this just another chapter in a life filled with pain and loss? As she drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams were plagued by the sound of horses galloping, gunshots, and the cold, indifferent face of her husband, Elias, whose betrayal lingered like a shadow in her heart. Tomorrow she would face whatever came next, whether it was peace, war, or something in between. She had no choice. The morning came too quickly, as it always did in the wilderness. Clara woke with the feeling of the cool desert wind brushing across her face, its sting reminding her that nothing in this new life could be trusted. She lay there for a moment, staring at the smoke that curled upward from the campfire just outside the shelter. The smell of burning sage mingled with the earthy scent of sweat and leather, a mixture that made her throat tight with anxiety. Kawea was already awake. His form was a dark silhouette against the rising sun as he knelt by the fire, sharpening his knife. His presence was commanding, yet Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for him. In the midst of her fear, she knew this man was more than just a warrior. He was a leader, a protector of his people. But what was he going to do with her and the twins? Clara's heart ached as she thought of her children, her babies, still so fragile. The one with the mark on his shoulder, the one Kawea had deemed touched by the Great Spirit, stirred uneasily in her arms. She whispered soothing words to him, but her mind was filled with questions. What did it mean? What had Kawea seen in that mark? Was her child destined for something far beyond her understanding? Awenita appeared at the entrance of Clara's shelter, her face softened by the early light. She nodded in acknowledgement, but there was no comfort in her eyes. Her role in the tribe was clear. She was one of the caretakers. Awenita moved with quiet grace, laying out a simple meal of dried meat and berries. She didn't speak, and Clara didn't push her to. It was a tense silence that filled the air, one where both women knew their places. As Clara ate, her mind returned to the gang that had chased them. Elias, her husband, was a man shaped by violence and cruelty. She knew that. But even as he had dragged her into this fugitive life, she had loved him. She had loved the man she thought he could be. The pieces of their life together felt fractured now, as if they were broken glass, scattered too far for her to ever put them back together. The more she tried to piece together the truth, the more elusive it became. Elias was a pistolero, one of those men who killed for money, for power, for reasons that Clara could never understand. She had always told herself she didn't want to know the whole story of his past. But now, with his betrayal lingering in the back of her mind, the truth gnawed at her. A long, low whistle broke her thoughts. It was Kawea, calling her to him. She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the twins, who were now both asleep in her arms. Then, with a sigh, she stood, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her chest like a boulder. As she approached him, the warriors in the camp stopped and watched her. Their stares were intense, each one holding a story she could never know. Kawea's eyes were on her, piercing through her, seeing things she wasn't ready to face. "Come," he said, his voice low but firm. "We ride today." Clara's stomach clenched. "Ride?" she repeated, her voice shaky. She had no idea where they were going or what they intended to do with her, but she knew that in this world, answers were often not given. They had to be fought for. Without a word, Kawea motioned for her to follow. Her legs felt heavy as she moved to one of the horses. A warrior passed her, offering her a steady hand to help her mount. Clara hesitated, not wanting to show weakness but struggling to maintain control of the fear building in her gut. As she climbed onto the horse, she caught a glimpse of Kawea giving orders to the rest of his warriors. They were preparing for something serious. She swallowed hard as she looked at the others around her. Each one of them carried the same fire in their eyes. They had a purpose, one she could not yet understand. The journey was long and silent, stretching on for what felt like hours. The sun burned fiercely in the sky, and the dusty trail seemed endless. The only sounds were the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves and the occasional clink of a weapon shifting in its holder. Clara, holding one of her twins tightly against her chest, felt as though she were drifting into a dream filled with faces she didn't recognize and voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her thoughts were tangled, like the wind in the sagebrush. It was near dusk when they arrived at the Comanche camp. Clara had expected it to be like the stories she had heard, an isolated, barren place filled with fire and blood. But what she saw was different. The camp was vibrant with life, filled with people who, despite their rugged exterior, seemed to have a deep connection to one another. Their faces were worn, weathered, but they were not without compassion. And yet, Clara still felt the cold pinch of uncertainty. She was the outsider here, a prisoner who didn't belong. She had no choice but to play along for now, to survive long enough to understand the nature of her captivity. Her heart raced as she wondered if this moment was truly the beginning of a new chapter, or the beginning of her end. As the night deepened, the tribesmen gathered around the central fire. Kawea sat at the forefront, his expression stoic. Clara was placed near him, her presence undeniable. The warriors spoke in low voices, exchanging words of fate, vengeance, and tradition. She couldn't follow their words, but she could feel the weight of their intentions pressing down on her. It was during one of these moments of tension that she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. One of the warriors, a man much younger than Kawea, glanced at her twin, the one with the mark. His eyes widened in something that resembled recognition, though Clara could not place it. Her breath caught as he slowly approached, kneeling before the child. He spoke something Clara couldn't understand, but his hands trembled as he reached out to touch the mark on the child's shoulder. Kawea's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, causing the young warrior to snap back to his feet. The murmurs of the tribe grew louder. There was something happening here, something Clara didn't understand, and as she looked from face to face, she realized her life, her children's lives, were no longer just about survival. They were about something far larger, something tied to the very soul of this land, and the consequences of this would be felt by everyone. Clara's breath hitched. Her world had just shifted, but before she could gather her thoughts, a harsh, cold voice rang out from the edge of the camp. "You've brought us a gift, Kawea," it sneered. "But what does it mean?" Clara's heart skipped, her body tensing. She wasn't sure who had spoken, but she knew that the real game was just beginning. The fire crackled loudly in the cold night air, but Clara barely noticed its warmth. The heat in her chest, in her veins, was much fiercer. Her eyes flickered to Kawea, who now stood facing the group of warriors who had gathered around the fire. The younger man, who had knelt before her child, stepped back into the shadows, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension that hung heavy in the air. The voice that had spoken so coldly cut through the silence like a blade. Clara's eyes darted toward the source. The man was tall, with hard, calculating eyes that swept over her like a predator sizing up its prey. His clothes were stained with dust, and his hands were marked by the wear of a life spent in battle. He looked like he belonged to a different world, one of violence and power. "Gift?" Kawea's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "She is no gift, but a sign," the man snorted, his lips curling in a sneer. "A sign of what?" he demanded, taking a step forward. "A woman with a bastard child? You're desperate, Kawea." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and she instinctively clutched her baby closer. The man's words felt like a slap in the face. It was obvious this wasn't just about survival anymore. Kawea's tribe, these warriors, were not just trying to protect her, they were trying to use her. And for what? The mark on her child, what did it mean? "Enough, Tala," Kawea said, his voice laced with authority. "Do not speak of her like that." Tala's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Clara thought he might challenge Kawea. But instead, he just gave a harsh, mocking laugh and stepped back into the crowd, the flicker of contempt never leaving his face. Kawea stood tall, his gaze unwavering, as if daring anyone to question him further. But Clara could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. The tension wasn't just between her and the tribe, it was between the men of the tribe themselves. They were all playing a dangerous game, and Clara had no idea what her role was in it. The night dragged on, the fire casting long shadows over the faces of the warriors, their eyes glinting in the dark. Clara could feel their eyes on her, and the discomfort in her chest tightened with every passing moment. She was an outsider in every sense of the word, with no real place among them. She had never felt more alone. As the warriors began to disperse, Kawea approached her again, his footsteps silent against the earth. His face was unreadable, but his eyes softened when they met hers. "Do not mind Tala," he said quietly. He is uncertain. This mark on your son has stirred more than just curiosity. Clara's heart skipped. What does it mean? Why is it so important? Kawea hesitated, his expression darkening. The mark, he said slowly, is a sign from the Great Spirit. It is said that when the Great Spirit wishes to intervene, he marks one of the chosen, and those chosen will have the power to change the fate of many. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Power, she repeated. My son is just a baby. Kawea shook his head. It is not just the child, he murmured. It is you as well. You are tied to this, whether you wish to be or not. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with an unspoken weight. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What had Elias done to bring them to this point? What had led them to this moment, this tribe, these people? She had only wanted to survive, to keep her children safe, but it seemed the universe had decided that survival wasn't enough. She had been swept into something much bigger than herself. Kawea placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. You will understand soon enough. The path you walk is a dangerous one, but it is the one you must follow now. Clara opened her mouth to ask more questions, but before she could, the sound of hooves approaching broke the moment. Her head snapped to the side, and she saw a rider silhouetted against the moonlit sky, a lone figure riding fast. The rider drew closer, and Clara's heart lurched. It was a man, dressed in weathered leather, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. But it was the unmistakable shape of a rifle slung across his back that sent a chill through her. Kawea, the man called out as he dismounted. His voice was rough, tired, and grating. The town is moving. They know she's here. Clara's pulse quickened. The town, she echoed, her throat tight. Who else? The man interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. The outlaws, your husband's friends. They're coming. The whole damn gang. Clara froze. Her stomach churned as a flood of memories came rushing back. Elias, his cold, distant eyes, the nights he had come home late, the whisper of secrets she had never dared to uncover. His betrayal was clear now, but the idea of him coming for her children, made her blood run cold. The gang? Kawea said, his voice steady but hard. How many? Too many, the rider replied with a grimace. And they're angry. Real angry. They've been hunting you for weeks. Clara could feel the panic rising in her chest. The outlaws, her husband's gang, were coming for them. She could see their faces in her mind, grizzled men who had no loyalty but to their own pockets. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And now the Comanches were involved. Clara had no idea what Kawea's tribe would do in the face of this new threat. But one thing was clear. The war for her life, for her children's future, was about to escalate. Kawea's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable but firm. You have no choice now, Clara. You must stay with us. The Great Spirit has placed a burden on your son, and we will protect you. But the outlaws will not stop. You have no choice but to fight. Clara's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. This was it. Her life, her children's fate was tied to the Comanches now. She couldn't run, she couldn't hide. She had to face whatever was coming, and she would do whatever it took to protect her family. But even as she nodded, a sense of dread clawed at her insides. The future was uncertain, and no one could tell her what would happen next. She glanced down at the marked twin, his small form nestled in her arms. Whatever power this mark signified, it wasn't something Clara could escape. And as the shadows lengthened around them, she realized that everything she thought she knew was slipping through her fingers. The game had changed, and there was no turning back. The sun hung low in the sky as the Comanche camp erupted into a flurry of activity. Clara could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as warriors mounted their horses and prepared for the coming conflict. The rider who had delivered the grim news had already returned to his post, his face set in a permanent scowl, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Kawea had gathered his warriors around the central fire, his face grim and determined. Clara stood at the edge of the group, holding her child tightly in her arms, feeling the watchful eyes of the tribe on her. She didn't belong here, not truly. She was a woman with a past, a mother with a story that was too complicated for these people to understand. But she had no choice now. Her fate, her children's future, was tied to theirs. Kawea's voice cut through the murmurs of the tribe, firm and commanding. "We do not fight for glory," he said, his eyes sweeping over the gathered warriors. "We fight because we must. The Great Spirit has chosen us to protect this land, and we will not let those who bring chaos take it from us." Clara's heart raced. The outlaws were coming, Elias's gang. They were ruthless, driven by greed and vengeance. She had seen the men Elias called friends. the same men who had killed without hesitation and stolen without remorse. She had never wanted that life, and yet it was the life she had been drawn into. Her husband's crimes, his secrets, were now coming back to claim her and her children. "Are we ready?" Kawea asked, his eyes meeting Clara's for a moment before returning to the warriors. Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry with fear. Ready? How could they be ready for this? She had no idea what the Comanches planned to do. She only knew that she was standing at the edge of a storm, and there was no way to outrun it. The warriors mounted their horses, their expressions hard, their bodies tense with anticipation. Kawea turned to Clara once more. "Stay close," he instructed. "Do not leave the camp. You and your children are safer here for now." Clara nodded, her hands trembling. The twins, both wrapped in furs, were quiet in her arms, their tiny breaths a soft reminder of what she was fighting for. They were innocent, too innocent for the violence that was about to be unleashed. She would protect them no matter what. As Kawea rode off with his warriors, Clara's eyes followed the trail of dust they left behind. Her mind was a whirlwind, torn between fear for her children and the nagging feeling that something far worse was waiting for her at the end of this journey. She tried to focus, to center herself in the moment, but her thoughts kept drifting to Elias. What had he done to lead them here? Why had he dragged her into a world filled with death and betrayal? She thought of the times they had shared, moments of tenderness amid the chaos, and then the darkness that had slowly crept into their relationship. She had never fully understood the man she had married, never fully known the depths of his past, and now it seemed that past was catching up with her in the most devastating way. Clara's fingers tightened around the twins, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to remember that they were her priority now. They were all she had left. Whatever happened next, she had to protect them. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp. The warriors returned, their faces grim and tired. The dust of the trail clung to their clothes, and their horses were worn from the ride. Kawea dismounted first, his eyes scanning the camp, taking in every detail. When he saw Clara, he gave her a brief nod before speaking to his warriors in their native tongue. The conversation was brief, but Clara didn't need to understand the words to know what had transpired. The battle was coming. The Comanches were preparing for war. Clara was led to the edge of the camp, where she could see the distant outlines of the outlaws' horses moving toward them. There were too many of them, more than Kawea's small band of warriors could handle. Clara felt a pang of panic rise in her chest. Titus had been right. They had no idea what they were up against. She knew with a sickening certainty that the gang wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. They would come for her children, and they would do whatever it took to get them. Elias, wherever he was, would be behind it all. He had betrayed her, and now his gang would finish what they had started. As the sun set, the warriors began to prepare. Kawea's movements were fluid, calculated. He didn't speak much, but Clara could see the burden in his eyes. He was a leader, a man with his own code of honor, but he was also a man who understood the stakes. This wasn't just about land or vengeance. This was about survival. Clara stood by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized that no matter what happened, nothing would be the same after this. She had no way of knowing if she and her children would make it out of this alive. A hand touched her shoulder, and Clara startled, turning to see Kawea standing behind her. His expression was somber, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his eyes, a hint of empathy, or perhaps understanding. "Stay close to the warriors," he said quietly. "Do not leave the camp. You are safer here." Clara nodded, but her heart was heavy. She knew she was safe for now, but how long would that last? The outlaws were coming, and they would not stop until they had their revenge. Her thoughts were interrupted as a distant sound reached her ears, footsteps, the thudding of hooves. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. The outlaws were closing in. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she turned to Kawea. "What do we do now?" Kawea looked at her, his gaze hardening. "We fight." The words rang in Clara's ears as the sound of the outlaws grew nearer. There was no turning back now. The fight was coming, and with it the truth of everything she had run from. As the warriors prepared for battle, Clara's heart raced with the knowledge that her life had changed forever. There was no escape from the past now. The storm was here, and it was coming for them all. The camp was alive with the sound of preparations. Horses were saddled, weapons were sharpened, and the warriors moved with the practiced fluidity of men who had seen countless battles. Clara stood at the edge of it all, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands still trembling as she held her children close. The twins, sensing the tension in the air, stirred restlessly in her arms. their tiny faces scrunching as if they too could feel the weight of the storm that was approaching. Kawea was in the center of the activity, his voice cutting through the murmurs of his warriors as he gave orders. His face was like stone, his expression unreadable, but Clara could see the burden in his eyes. He was a man who had lived through violence, who had seen the destruction that came with it. But even he couldn't hide the fact that this battle, this fight against the outlaws, was unlike anything the tribe had faced before. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage, the smoke curling into the night sky. Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never wanted this life. She had never wanted any of it. The violence, the bloodshed, the betrayal. All she had ever wanted was peace. A life with her husband and children, far from the reach of men like Elias's gang. But now she was here, standing on the precipice of something much larger than herself. The outlaws were closing in, and Kawea's warriors were preparing for a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Clara's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first glimmers of the approaching riders were visible in the distance. The shadows of their horses stretched long across the ground, a foreboding sign of the danger that was drawing closer with each passing minute. Her thoughts drifted to Elias. She could still hear his voice in her head, the cold, calculated tone he had when he spoke of survival, of doing whatever it took to stay alive. He had always been a man of extremes, someone who lived by his own rules, someone who was willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to keep moving forward. She had loved him once, or at least she had thought she had. But now looking back, she realized that love had been clouded by the lies he had told, the secrets he had kept hidden from her. Elias had been part of this world of violence and betrayal, of men who killed without remorse, of men who fought for power and land without regard for who they hurt. And now his past was hunting her, his gang was hunting her, and her children, her innocent children, were caught in the crossfire. Clara, Kawea's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing beside her, his eyes locked onto hers with a rare intensity. There was something in his gaze, something that felt like a weighty responsibility, a burden that he had not asked for but was now shouldering. "They are coming," Kawea said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of finality. "We will defend the camp. You must stay with the others. Do not leave. Keep your children close." Clara nodded, her throat dry. "But what if they don't stop? What if they come for me, for my children?" Kawea's expression softened just slightly. "They will come," he said, his voice low, "but we will not let them take you. We fight for our survival, for the land, and for the future. Your son, he is part of that future." Her heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a punch. Her son, the child with the mark, the one the tribe believed was destined for something greater. But what? What could a child, an innocent baby, do in the face of men like Elias's gang? "Stay close," Kawea repeated, his gaze intense. "Trust in us." Clara watched him as he turned to join his warriors, his form blending into the shadows of the camp. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that they could protect her, that they could protect her children. But the fear gnawing at her insides was hard to ignore. She couldn't escape her past, no matter how far she ran. The outlaws, Elias, they were coming for her. And as the distant thunder of hooves grew louder, Clara realized that the war wasn't just between the Comanches and the outlaws. It was between her past and her future, between the choices she had made and the ones she would make now. The first shots rang out just after the moon reached its peak. Clara jumped, instinctively shielding her children with her body as the ground trembled beneath the weight of the incoming riders. The warriors had taken their positions, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And then, with a sudden roar, the battle began. Shouts and screams echoed through the night as the Comanches engaged the outlaws. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, mingling with the battle cries of the warriors. Clara's heart raced as she crouched low to the ground, clutching the twins tightly to her chest. The camp around her was a whirlwind of chaos. Men on horseback, the clash of metal, the thud of bodies hitting the earth. Her mind raced with terror, her thoughts spinning with fear for her children. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't keep them safe if the violence reached her. She had to run, had to escape. But where? The outlaws were everywhere. The camp was surrounded. The battle raged on, and Clara felt the weight of helplessness settle over her like a heavy cloak. She had no control over what was happening. All she could do was hold her children and pray that the Comanches could protect them. As the sounds of the fight grew louder, Clara heard a voice, low and familiar, cut through the chaos. "Clara!" Her head snapped up. She recognized that voice. Elias. Fear shot through her like a bolt of lightning. And for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze, The man who had abandoned her, the man who had betrayed her, was here, among the outlaws. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He was close, too close. And then, before she could react, a figure moved between her and the advancing gang, Kawea. He was on horseback. A warrior's war cry on his lips as he charged into the fray, cutting through the chaos like a storm. His blade flashed in the firelight as he fought with the precision of a man who had lived for this moment, who had been shaped by the violence he was now unleashing. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The battle was just beginning, and in the distance she could see Elias's face filled with anger and something else, something Clara couldn't quite place. But it didn't matter now. The fight was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. The battle raged on, the fate of her children and herself hanging by a thread. Clara's mind screamed for a way out, but she had no answers, no escape. The night was long, the future uncertain, but one thing was clear. The past had come for her, and now she would have to fight too. The chaos of the battle tore through the night like a violent storm, each clash of swords, each crack of gunfire, sending tremors through Clara's body. Her heart pounded in her chest as she huddled close to the fire, the heat from the flames barely cutting through the biting chill of fear that gripped her. The world was a blur of shadows and screams, the sounds of hooves pounding into the earth, warriors yelling in defiance, and the crackle of musket shots. Clara could see the outlines of men fighting, Comanche and outlaw alike, moving in and out of the firelight like specters. The ground was littered with the fallen, some still, others writhing in agony. She could smell the gunpowder in the air, the metallic scent of blood, and beneath it all the scent of her own rising panic. Clara! The voice rang out again, familiar, too familiar. Elias. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she was paralyzed. The man who had left her to die, the one who had dragged her into this nightmare, was here, charging through the battle with his gang. His figure emerged from the shadows, his hat low over his face, a rifle slung across his back. His eyes, dark and cold, scanned the battlefield with a cruel focus. And then she saw it, a look, one that spoke volumes, between Elias and the leader of the gang, a man with a scar running down his cheek. A deal had been struck. Clara's blood ran cold. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was personal. Her eyes darted to Kawea, who was fighting in the thick of it, his movements fierce and sure. His men were holding the line, but it was clear that the Comanche warriors were outnumbered. Elias and his gang had come prepared, armed, angry, and willing to do whatever it took to finish what they had started. Clara's heart raced. She had to protect her children. She had to... Clara! Elias's voice cut through the smoke and chaos again, louder this time. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with a fury that seemed to burn through the darkness. Get over here, now! Her body froze. Everything in her screamed to run, to flee into the desert with her children, and never look back. But she couldn't leave. Her family was still here. Her life was still here. And she knew that if she tried to escape, Elias wouldn't hesitate to hunt them down. The Comanches were battling for survival, but so was she. Kawea's voice broke through her thoughts as he emerged from the melee, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice low and hard. "Do not let him get close." Clara didn't need to ask why. She knew that Elias was no longer the man she had once loved. He was part of this war now, and his allegiance was to his gang, his thirst for power and revenge. She could see it in his eyes, and she knew that she couldn't trust him. As Elias charged toward her, his gun drawn, Clara's heart clenched in her chest. Her mind raced. She couldn't let him near the children. Not now, not ever again. Without thinking, Clara grabbed one of the small knives Kawea had left by her side. It was dull and crude, not the weapon of a trained fighter, but it was all she had. Her fingers tightened around the hilt as she prepared herself for the confrontation that was now inevitable. Elias was getting closer. His lips curled into a mocking grin as he saw her standing there holding the knife. The look in his eyes was colder than any she had ever seen. "You think you can stop me, Clara?" Elias spat. "You think you can escape what you've done, what I've done?" Clara's body tensed, every muscle ready to fight, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't. She wouldn't let her children be caught in the crossfire of this war. "I'm not running anymore, Elias," she said, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. "I'm done with you, done with your lies. This isn't your fight anymore." For a moment, Elias hesitated. His eyes flickered with something. Regret? Guilt? But it was gone before she could process it. He lifted his rifle, pointing it directly at her. "Don't make me do this," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You've already chosen a side, and now I'll make you regret it." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her hand tightened around the knife, but before she could react, a blur of motion cut between them. Kawea. In an instant, Kawea's blade was out, his body a wall of strength between Clara and Elias. The air around them seemed to still as the two men locked eyes, one a man who had sworn to protect his people, and the other, a man consumed by rage and betrayal. "You'll have to go through me," Kawea growled, his voice filled with raw power. Elias sneered, his rifle trained on Kawea's chest. "I'll make sure your blood stains the ground, just like everyone else's." But Kawea wasn't intimidated. He stood tall, unwavering, his presence a force of nature. The standoff was short-lived. Kawea's eyes flicked to the warriors behind him, and within moments, several of them had surrounded Elias and his gang, forcing them into a tense standoff. The two sides were locked in a deadly stalemate, the air thick with tension, the sound of the battle raging around them. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. Kawea's warriors were skilled, fearless, but they were outnumbered. Elias's gang, despite being outmatched, was ruthless and hungry for blood. Everything Clara had feared, everything she had tried to outrun was coming to a head. The war wasn't just for her survival, it was a war for everything she held dear. Kawea's eyes met hers for a brief, fleeting moment. His expression was calm, but there was an undeniable sadness in his gaze. He wasn't just fighting for the Comanches, he was fighting for Clara's future, for the future of her children. And in that moment, Clara realized something that hit her like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't just caught in the middle of a battle between two worlds. She was part of something much bigger, a story that spanned generations, a story of vengeance, of survival and of honor. And she was going to have to fight for her place in it. As the standoff continued, Clara's eyes never left Elias. His cold eyes, full of contempt, locked onto hers, as though daring her to make a move. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. The war was only just beginning, and she would have to face her past to survive what was coming next. In the distance, the sounds of the battle began to fade, drowned out by the thunderous beating of her heart. The storm was here, and there was no turning back now. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke and blood. As the battle outside the perimeter of the camp raged on, Clara's hands trembled as she held the twins close to her chest, her body pressed low to the ground behind the shelter of a half-burned cart. Every muscle in her body was tense, every nerve screaming with fear. She could hear the gunfire, the yells, and the clash of steel, but it all felt so distant, as if she were on the edge of a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The face of Elias haunted her mind, his cold eyes locked onto hers, as though he were trying to rip apart everything she had fought for. She had spent so much of her life running from the truth, running from the shadows of her past, but now she had nowhere to hide. Now the past had caught up with her, and the cost of that was far higher than she could have ever imagined. "Clara!" Kawe's voice cut through the chaos, his figure emerging from the smoke, his silhouette a beacon in the madness of the battlefield. "Stay low, stay out of sight." She nodded quickly, instinctively pressing her body into the dirt, shielding the babies as best as she could. Her heart raced as she watched Kawea disappear into the fray, the warriors of his tribe moving like shadows, graceful, lethal, and intent on survival. The battle was unfolding around her, a violent storm of violence and fury. The Comanches were holding their ground, but it was clear that Elias and his gang had no intention of backing down. The outlaws were relentless, driven by anger and a thirst for vengeance. Clara's thoughts darted back to her husband. He had abandoned her, yes. But was it possible that the man she had once loved still lingered somewhere beneath the surface of that cruel, cold exterior? Or had he truly become something else entirely? Something monstrous? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash. A body hit the ground nearby with a sickening thud. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She dared a glance to the side, her breath hitching in her throat, when she saw one of the warriors fall, an arrow lodged deep in his side. The Comanches were losing ground. Kawea was still leading his men with courage, but the outlaws were a swarm, a tide that couldn't be pushed back easily. "Clara!" Kawea's voice again, but this time it was different. There was urgency in it, a command. She didn't hesitate. Her heart pounding, Clara scooped up the twins, holding them tight to her chest as she crawled toward the entrance of the camp. The fighting was getting closer. The lines between friend and foe were blurring, and the danger was closing in fast. She could hear the sounds of hooves thundering as more of the gang arrived. Kawea was nowhere to be seen, but she knew he was still out there, still fighting. He had led his warriors into battle, and even though the odds were stacked against them, Clara knew he would fight to the bitter end. His people had fought for their land, for their honor, for their future, and she was now a part of that struggle, whether she liked it or not. As Clara crept along the perimeter of the camp, her mind raced. She knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for the Comanches to win. This was her fight too. If the outlaws reached her children, if they reached her, there would be no escaping them. Elias would see to it that she paid the ultimate price. Her hands shook as she reached the edge of the camp, moving into the shadows of a large rock formation. Her thoughts were jumbled, all fighting for prominence, fear, anger, confusion, and the deep gnawing pain of betrayal. She had to find a way out. She had to find a way to survive. But then she heard it, a voice. Clara. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her breath hitched. That voice. It was Elias again. She turned slowly, her heart in her throat. There, standing at the entrance of the shelter, was Elias, rifle raised, his eyes burning with something that was far from remorse. Elias! Her voice barely escaped her lips, the word tasting like ash. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. But there he was, her husband, standing before her, standing, the same man who had once promised to protect her, to love her, but who had now become an instrument of destruction. His face was harder than ever, the shadows of the battlefield falling over him like a shroud. His hand tightened on the rifle, and Clara could see the anger in his eyes. "You think you can hide from me? Clara," he sneered. "You think you can run from what you've done?" Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to try to talk her into coming back. He was here for one thing only, the twins. Her blood ran cold. She could feel it in her bones, the finality in his words. This wasn't a fight to save her or her children. It was a fight for control, a fight to claim what he thought was his, and he would stop at nothing to win it. "You left me, Elias," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You walked away. You left me to die with no explanation. I'm not yours anymore." Elias's eyes flashed with something that could have been regret, but it was quickly masked by a cold, calculated fury. "You don't get to walk away, Clara," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You made your choice, and now it's time to pay for it." He moved closer, his fingers tightening on the rifle. Clara's heart raced as she backed away, instinctively clutching the twins to her chest. She couldn't let him near them. She couldn't let him take them. Coe appeared behind Elias in a blur of motion, his body a dark shadow against the flames. Before Clara could react, Coe's hand was on Elias's arm, pulling the rifle from his grasp, in a move so fast it was almost impossible to track. "Get away from her," Coe growled, his voice like gravel. His gaze locked with Elias's, burning with the weight of 1,000 battles fought for survival. "This ends here." Elias struggled, trying to wrestle free, but Coe was stronger, faster. With a powerful shove, he pushed Elias back, knocking him to the ground. "Stay down," Coe commanded, his voice unwavering as he stood over Elias. Elias growled in frustration, his hands gripping the dirt, his breath ragged with fury. "You can't protect her forever, Comanche," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "She'll never be yours." Coe's eyes darkened, his hand still on the hilt of his blade. But before he could reply, Clara's voice broke through the tension like a crack of thunder. "No, Elias," she said, stepping forward, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not yours. I never was, and I never will be again." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Elias froze, his eyes wide in disbelief. For the first time since their marriage had begun to fall apart, Clara felt like she had reclaimed something, her power, her agency, her right to live. And as the battle raged on around them, Clara realized that the fight for her children's future, for her own survival, wasn't just a war of violence. It was a battle for the truth, and she would fight for it no matter the cost. The echoes of the battle rumbled through the night as Clara looked into Elias's eyes, her heart no longer filled with fear, but with determination. The war was far from over, but this fight was hers to win. The night stretched long, an endless suffocating blanket that covered the battlefield in its dark embrace. Clara stood in the midst of it, her breath shallow, her heart still pounding from the confrontation with Elias. It felt as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. Kauja had not moved from his position over Elias. The man lay in the dirt, dazed but still breathing, his rage simmering beneath the surface. Clara's eyes never left him, though she could feel the pull of the battle around her, the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded, the chaotic rhythm of the ongoing fight. She could hear the distant crackle of gunfire, the clash of steel, but it was all distant now, as if it were happening in another world entirely. In this moment, there was only her and the ghosts of the past. Coe, sensing her presence beside him, stood silently for a moment before his voice broke through the tension. "Are you all right?" His question was quiet but filled with genuine concern, his gaze flickering to the twins nestled in Clara's arms. They were still, their small faces peaceful in their sleep, untouched by the violence surrounding them. Clara nodded, though the question hung in the air. Was she all right? What did that even mean now? Was she safe? Was she ever truly safe? I don't know anymore, she whispered, her voice hoarse from the emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. Kawea's eyes softened, but he didn't respond immediately. His focus was on Elias, who was slowly pushing himself up from the ground. His face twisted with frustration and disbelief. The gang leader's pride was wounded, and that kind of wound often bled the most. "You've chosen your path," Kawea said finally, turning his back on Elias. "As have I." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She had made her choice, hadn't she? But what if it wasn't a choice? What if fate had simply dragged her to this point, where there was no escape from the battle that had already been written for her and her children? Kawea motioned for her to follow him, and without a word, Clara did. They moved away from Elias, who, despite the defeat, was still trying to gather himself, his anger palpable even in his silence. Clara could feel his eyes boring into her back as they walked away, but there was nothing left for her in his gaze. No love, no regret, only the desire to control. Kawea led her to a small, sheltered area behind a line of rocks, away from the main battleground. The sounds of the fight grew quieter as they distanced themselves. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to breathe, her body collapsing against a large stone, exhaustion finally taking its toll. She glanced at Kawea, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as always. But in that moment, Clara could see the weight of the battle in his eyes, the heavy toll of leadership, the responsibility of guiding his people in a fight for survival. Kawea didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he watched the distant flames flicker, as if lost in his thoughts. Then finally he looked at her, his gaze steady. "Your children," he began softly, his voice carrying an odd softness that Clara had not expected from him. "They carry the mark. That is a truth we cannot deny. But that mark, Clara, it is not just a blessing, it is a burden." Clara's heart tightened at his words. She knew the mark was important. She had known from the moment Kawea had seen it, from the moment the tribe had whispered their reverence for it, but she had never allowed herself to truly understand its weight. Until now. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind reeling with the weight of his statement. Kawea took a deep breath, his gaze distant as if he were summoning the ghosts of his ancestors for guidance. "The mark means something, Clara. It is the symbol of the Great Spirit, a sign that your child is the one to lead the tribe into a new age. But it is also a sign of conflict, of war. You have brought more than just yourself to this land." Clara's chest tightened. She glanced down at the twins in her arms, their peaceful faces so unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. They were babies, innocent, untouched by the world's cruelty, and yet their very existence seemed to be the center of a war, a battle between destiny and free will. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't ask for any of it. I didn't ask for a past that haunts me, or a future that is decided for me. I only want to protect them, Kawea. That's all I want." Kawea's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice remained firm. "You are not alone in this, Clara. You are not the only one who has been shaped by the past. The Comanches fight for survival, yes, but we also fight for something more, something that has been lost for too long. This war is not just about land. It is about honor. It is about protecting the future of our people, the future that the Great Spirit has chosen." Clara swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. What was she supposed to do with this information? How could she possibly understand it, let alone accept it? She had no place in this world. She was a woman with a past full of lies and pain, and the only thing that mattered now was her children, her twins who carried the weight of a prophecy they could never have asked for. "But I didn't choose this for them," she whispered, her eyes searching Kawea's. "I didn't choose this path for them." "No," Kawea replied, his voice steady. "But they are the future now, and we will protect them, Clara, even if it means giving everything, even if it means facing the darkness of the past head-on." Clara felt a pang of fear. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. It would be a battle. It would be a battle between her love for her children and the forces beyond her control. And in that battle, the stakes were higher than anything she had ever known. As she stared at the firelight in the distance, Clara realized that the war wasn't just outside, it was inside her too. The fight for her children's future, the fight to protect them, was a war she had already begun, but she couldn't fight it alone. Kawea was right. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had been written long before she ever stepped foot on this land. The mark on her son's shoulder was no longer just a symbol of the past. It was a key to the future of the Comanches, a key to the future of her children. and it was up to her now to decide how that future would unfold. The sounds of the battle outside continued to echo through the night, but Clara knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a pale, golden hue over the battlefield. The flickering flames from the dying campfires danced in the distance, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked earth. The battle had raged through the night, and the Comanches had paid a heavy price. Clara could see the bodies of the fallen warriors and outlaws scattered across the camp, reminders of the violence that had consumed them all. But amidst the wreckage, there was a stillness, a quiet before the storm. Clara sat near the remnants of a broken wagon, her children curled in her arms. The twins were sleeping, but Clara couldn't find peace in their soft breaths. The weight of the night, the choices, the battles, the betrayals, was too heavy for her to shake. Her thoughts drifted to Kawea, who was standing some distance away speaking with his warriors. His face, usually so composed, now showed the strain of leadership, of a man who had led his people into a fight they hadn't asked for, a fight that had taken more than just lives, it had taken hope. And now, with the outlaws pushed back for the moment, Clara couldn't help but wonder what would come next. She felt the heavy gaze of Elias lingering on her, even though he was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't just a threat to her. He was a threat to the future she had tried to build, to the life she had fought to protect. He had left her, abandoned her with nothing but his ghost, and now he had returned seeking to claim what he believed was rightfully his. But Clara was no longer the woman he had left behind. She had changed, and the thought that she could still be tethered to him, even by the thinnest thread, was a burden she couldn't bear. The mark on her son's shoulder wasn't just a symbol, it was a symbol of power, of a fate that was thrust upon them, one that she had no say in. Her children were now part of something larger than herself, and that truth was as terrifying as it was inevitable. The mark of the Great Spirit wasn't just a blessing, it was a responsibility. "Clara!" Kawea's voice broke her thoughts, pulling her from the depths of her mind. She looked up to see him standing before her, his figure tall and unyielding against the soft light of dawn. His eyes were sharp, but there was a softness in them now that hadn't been there before. She could see the weight of everything he had fought for etched in his features, his people, his tribe, his own survival. He stood silent for a moment, watching her before finally speaking again. "The battle is over for now, but the war has just begun." Clara nodded, her heart heavy. "I know," she whispered. The words came out like a confession, a truth that had settled deep in her bones. "You've seen what happens when there is no unity," Kawea continued, his voice measured. "What happens when a people are divided. You've seen the destruction Elias and his kind bring." Clara looked away, her gaze falling to the twins. The little ones were still so fragile, so innocent. It felt wrong to think of them in the context of war, their violence, but she couldn't ignore it. It was in their blood now. Their future was intertwined with the future of the Comanches. "I didn't want this life for them," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling. "I wanted to protect them from all of this, from the violence, from the war, but now, I don't know how to keep them safe." Kawea's expression softened, and for a moment he allowed himself to step closer, kneeling in front of her. The warmth of his presence was unexpected, but welcome. It had been a long time since Clara had allowed herself to feel the comfort of someone else's presence. "You're not alone in this," Kawea said firmly. "The future of the Comanches is tied to your children, but it's also tied to you. We will protect them. You don't have to do this alone." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes locking with his. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was a future for her children here, in this world of constant conflict, constant bloodshed. But she had seen enough to know that survival in this world came at a cost, and the cost of protecting her children might be higher than she was willing to pay. Kawea seemed to sense her hesitation. "We are fighting for something more than land. We are fighting for honor, for the survival of our people. The world outside, your world, is not the world of the Comanches. We are different, and the Great Spirit has marked your son for a reason. He will lead us into the future, but only if we fight for it together." The words struck her deeply, as if a part of her, buried under layers of fear and doubt, recognized the truth in them. Her children and the mark on her son's shoulder were the key to something greater. But it wasn't just the Comanches who would decide what that future looked like. It was Clara, and that was the part that terrified her the most. She was part of this now, whether she wanted to be or not. The sounds of the battle had faded into a distant hum, but the echoes of what had happened were still in the air, thick and unrelenting. Clara felt herself shaking with exhaustion. Physical, emotional, mental. There was no simple solution to what had happened. No easy escape. The past had closed in on her, and now the only way forward was through it. "How long can we keep fighting?" Clara asked, her voice soft, the weight of everything pressing down on her. How long before it consumes us all? Kauea stood slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. As long as it takes, he said, his voice steady. As long as we still breathe, as long as we still have hope. Hope. It felt like a fragile thing, like a flicker of light in an endless night. But in that moment, standing there with Kauea, with her children in her arms, Clara realized something. She couldn't protect them from the world. She couldn't shield them from the violence, from the bloodshed, from the choices that others had made long before they were born. But she could fight. She could fight with everything she had, no matter the cost, and she would fight for them, for her children, for their future. Kauea extended a hand to her, his eyes filled with understanding. Clara took it, her grip firm, her heart stronger than it had ever been. Together, Kauea said. Clara nodded, the weight of the decision settling in her chest. Together. The world was still dark, and the sounds of the battle echoed in the distance, but Clara no longer felt lost in it. The fight was just beginning, and though the road ahead was fraught with danger, she knew one thing for sure. She would not face it alone, and together they would carve a future from the ashes of the past. The flames of war had not yet extinguished, but Clara had found her purpose, and she would fight until the very end. The quiet after the battle was deafening. The winds shifted across the broken landscape, carrying with it the lingering smell of smoke and death. Clara stood by the edge of the camp, her children bundled up tightly in her arms, their faces still. She had never felt so alone, yet so surrounded by the weight of the world. The Comanches had won for now. The outlaws had been pushed back, their wounded carried off into the shadows, and their dead left behind as grim reminders of what had transpired. But Clara knew that this wasn't over. The victory was temporary. The war, as Kauea had said, was just beginning. She turned her gaze toward the distant horizon, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the battlefield. The land looked peaceful, almost serene, but Clara knew the truth. There was no peace here, not now, not after everything that had happened. The blood that had soaked into the earth would never be washed away. Clara, Kauea's voice interrupted her thoughts, low and steady. He approached her from behind, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He had a way of moving silently, as though the world itself parted for him. She didn't turn to face him right away, instead looking down at her children. Her son, the one with the mark, was starting to stir. Clara's heart clenched as she watched him, his tiny hand reaching out in his sleep, as if he were searching for something. She feared that just like her, he would never truly be able to escape this life. Turning to face Kauea, Clara spoke quietly. What happens now? Kauea's expression was unreadable, his dark eyes steady. We rebuild, we heal, we prepare. Prepare for what? Clara's voice shook slightly as she asked the question she already knew the answer to. The outlaws will come again. Elias will never stop coming for us, will he? Kauea stood silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. Elias will never stop, but neither will we. Clara's heart sank. And the children? The future? What do we tell them when they grow up knowing that they are the reason for all of this? The mark on her son's shoulder was like a brand, a sign of destiny, a sign of power. But it was also a curse. It had already drawn the world's attention, and Clara had no idea how to protect her children from the forces that now circled them like vultures. "I will tell them the truth," Kauea said firmly, as if there was no question in it. "You will tell them that they are the future of the Comanche people, that they carry the strength of the Great Spirit in them, and you will teach them to wield that strength with honor." Clara's heart felt heavy as she nodded, but the words didn't soothe her. What honor was there in war? What honor was there in a life that had been forced upon her children before they could even speak? "You don't have to do this alone," Kauea added, his voice softer now, yet no less resolute. "You and your children are part of this tribe now. We are family, and family fights together." The weight of those words settled on Clara's shoulders like a mountain. She didn't know if she was ready to carry the responsibility, but she knew she had no choice. The choice had been made for her when she was swept into this war, when she was marked as a mother of the future of the Comanches. She couldn't run from it anymore. But she also knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. Later that day, as the tribe gathered around the central fire, Clara watched the warriors move about the camp with the same calm determination that had guided them through the night's battle. Despite the losses, there was a sense of unity that Clara hadn't felt before. She was still an outsider, still a woman marked by the past, but here, in the shadow of the Comanches, she was no longer invisible. Kauea stood at the center of the gathering, addressing the tribe in their language, his words solemn but full of authority. Clara didn't understand the specifics, but she could feel the power in them. The tribe was rallying, preparing for what was coming, She felt a hand on her shoulder, and when she looked up, she saw Awenita, the young woman who had quietly tended to her during the early days of her captivity. Awenita's dark eyes met hers, filled with silent understanding. "You are not alone," Awenita said, her voice soft but strong. "We stand with you." Clara gave a small, grateful nod. She had never truly understood the bond that tied these people together, their loyalty to each other, their connection to the land, to their ancestors. But now she could feel it deep in her bones. It was a bond that couldn't be broken even by betrayal, even by bloodshed. As Awenita walked away, Clara felt a strange sense of peace begin to settle in her chest. She wasn't alone. She might not have chosen this life, but it was the one she had now. And for her children, for their future, she would fight for it with everything she had. The night passed slowly, the sounds of the camp mingling with the crackling fire, the murmurs of warriors making their preparations for the next phase of the struggle. Clara lay awake, her arms wrapped around her children, her mind whirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. Elias, the outlaws, the future. They were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet complete. But one thing was certain, she would not let her children be the ones to pay the price for the past. As the days passed, the tension in the air only grew. Every morning, Clara woke to the realization that her children were no longer just innocent babes. They were the future, and their lives had already been shaped by forces far beyond their control. The mark on her son's shoulder was a constant reminder of the responsibility she had been given, a responsibility that now weighed heavier than ever. Kiowa spoke often of the need to prepare for the next wave of conflict. The Comanches would not sit idle, and neither would Clara. She had never been a warrior, never a fighter, but she had learned quickly that there was no room for hesitation in this world. She would protect her children no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Clara found herself learning from the warriors, the women, and even Kiowa. She learned the ways of survival in a world that offered no mercy. She learned how to move silently, how to gather what was needed for the tribe's survival. She learned the weight of leadership, even if it wasn't hers to bear. And slowly, Clara began to understand the truth of Kiowa's words. The fight wasn't just for survival, it was for the future. It was for the future of the Comanches, yes, but it was also for her children, for the future they would inherit. She didn't know what that future would look like, but she knew one thing. She would be there, standing beside her children, standing beside Kiowa and the tribe, when the time came to face whatever was coming. The future had been written for them all, and now, all she could do was fight for it. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Clara felt a quiet strength begin to rise within her. She was no longer just a woman caught in the middle of a war. She was a mother, a protector, a warrior in her own right. And with that knowledge, the path ahead, no matter how treacherous, seemed a little less uncertain. The storm was far from over, but together they would face it, and together they would win. The days following the battle were marked by a tense, relentless quiet that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time. The Comanches, though victorious, carried the weight of loss. The bodies of fallen warriors had been laid to rest, the rituals of their passing solemn and unhurried, as if the tribe needed this moment to pause, to remember, to mourn. Yet, in every corner of the camp, there was a feeling that they were already preparing for the next fight. The outlaws were only momentarily defeated, and they would be back. This war was far from over. Clara found herself torn between the exhaustion that pressed against her bones and the burning urgency that had taken root in her heart. She knew she couldn't just wait and hide. She had to act. She had to be ready. And for her children's sake, she would not shrink from the life that had been forced upon her. Her son, the one with the mark of the Great Spirit, had begun to stir more often. At night, Clara would catch herself staring at the symbol on his shoulder, her fingers lightly brushing over it, as though she could somehow understand the prophecy, the weight of it by touch alone. She had learned more from Kiowa and the tribe in these past few days than she ever had in her entire life. But there were still pieces to this puzzle that eluded her, and those pieces were becoming ever more critical. It wasn't just the outlaws they had to worry about. The Comanches were divided, as any people in the midst of a long struggle would be. Some, like Kiowa, held firm to the old ways, the belief that the tribe's survival depended on their unity, their sacred traditions. Others, disillusioned by years of violence, began to question the path forward. It wasn't just the threat of Elias's gang that Clara had to contend with. There were factions within the Comanches themselves, each pulling in different directions, each believing their way was the only way forward. Clara had spent the past few days observing, quietly listening, trying to make sense of the chaos that swirled around her. In the mornings, she would tend to her children, feeding them and making sure they were safe. And in the afternoons, She would work with the women of the tribe, learning their ways, how to survive, how to protect her family, how to live without fear. But at night her mind would wander back to the same questions. Was the mark on her son a blessing or a curse? What would it mean for their future? And why had she been chosen to bear the weight of this new life, this new path? Kauea had been distant in the days following the battle. It wasn't the cold distance of indifference, but the guarded distance of someone who had seen too much, someone who had lived through too many battles to allow himself to feel too much. Clara understood. Leadership had a price, and Kauea had paid it in full. That night, as the fire in the center of the camp burned low, Clara found herself alone, sitting beside the embers, her thoughts drifting. The quiet felt unnatural, a momentary calm before the next storm. She could hear the rustle of the wind in the trees, the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching. It was Kauea. He didn't speak at first, simply sat down beside her. His presence was solid, grounding in a way that Clara found comforting even as her mind raced. "We've been preparing," Kauea said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, his tone measured. "The outlaws will return soon, but we must be ready for more than just them. There are those within the tribe who are questioning the leadership. There are others who will take advantage of the chaos. We are not just fighting the enemy outside, we are fighting within ourselves." Clara looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What does that mean? Who's questioning your leadership?" Kauea hesitated for a moment before answering. "There are factions, Clara. Some of the elders, the warriors who have fought longer than I have, do not agree with my vision. They believe that the Comanches must return to the old ways, to their traditions, to their ancestral land. They think I've abandoned too much. I've been more open to change, to building alliances. They think it will weaken us." "Is that what you want?" Clara asked softly. "Change? Alliances?" Kauea's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Clara saw the weight of everything he carried. The tribe, the responsibility of the future, the constant threat of annihilation. It was all on his shoulders. "I want what is best for my people," Kauea said, his voice firm but not without doubt. "But sometimes what is best isn't clear. The old ways may have kept us alive, but they have also kept us in the past. The future, Clara, the future will not wait for us to decide whether we're ready for it. It will come regardless." Clara's heart tightened as she absorbed his words. "And my son?" she asked. "What is his role in all of this? Is he truly the one the Great Spirit has chosen?" Kauea's gaze softened, a rare vulnerability flashing in his eyes. "The mark on your son's shoulder, it means something, but the future is not set in stone. It is shaped by those who are willing to fight for it. Your son is not the only one with a role to play in the future, but his role, his power, it may be the key to bridging the gap between the old and the new, between the Comanches and the world outside." Clara sat in silence, processing his words. The weight of what Kauea was saying sank in. The power her son held wasn't just symbolic, it was real, it was dangerous, and it could change everything. "And what if we can't bridge that gap?" Clara asked, her voice low, filled with the uncertainty that had plagued her since the moment she stepped into this new world. "What if the war within us is too great?" Kauea didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the distant shadows, where the remnants of the battle could still be seen. "Then we fight," he said simply, the conviction in his voice making Clara's chest tighten with a strange, burning resolve. "We fight, because that is all we have left." The words hung in the air like the distant sound of thunder on the horizon. Clara knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The war wasn't just for survival, it was for something greater, something that she wasn't sure she was ready to fight for. But as she looked at Kauea, the man who had stood by his people, who had fought for honor and survival, she realized that she wasn't alone. They would fight together, no matter the cost. The days grew shorter and the preparations intensified. Clara could feel the change in the air, the calm before the storm, and she knew, deep in her bones, that the time for hiding was over. Her son's future was tied to this world, to the Comanches, to the battle that would determine whether they survived or disappeared into history, and she would be there by his side, ready to fight for the future they had yet to define. The war was far from over, and the true battle, the one that would decide their fate, was just beginning. The day arrived like a suffocating fog, heavy, thick, and impossible to ignore. Clara stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the distance, her hands clenched around the twins, their faces now alert as if sensing the storm approaching. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the distant sounds of the warriors' preparations echoing through the camp. There was no more hiding, no more waiting. The fight, the one that would define their future, had finally arrived. Clara had spent the last few days with Kauea, learning, listening, and trying to piece together the fragments of the world that had been thrust upon her. She had seen the fractures within the tribe, the divisions between those who wanted to preserve the old ways and those who sought a future that could not be defined by the blood of the past. Kawea had said it himself, the battle for survival was as much within as it was without. The mark on her son's shoulder was no longer just a symbol, it was a banner, a call to action, whether Clara wanted it or not. Her son was part of something greater than any of them could fully understand, and the time for questions had passed. The only thing left was to face what was coming. In the quiet moments, Clara found herself wondering if she could ever truly belong to this world. The Comanches had accepted her, yes, but only because they had no other choice. She was an outsider, a woman shaped by a world of betrayal, by a past she couldn't outrun. And yet, she had come to realize that her children would be the bridge between two worlds, the old world of the Comanches and the new world that was unfolding before them all. They carried the weight of that legacy, that responsibility. And now, as the camp began to stir with the whispers of the impending attack, Clara knew that their future, the future of her children, was at the mercy of the choices they all made in the coming hours. The outlaws would come for them. Elias would come for her children, but so would those within the tribe who sought to take the power her son carried for themselves. There was no way to avoid it. She had always known that survival came at a price, but now it was clear survival would cost more than she had ever imagined. Clara. Kawea's voice broke through her thoughts, and for the first time in days, she found herself looking at him without hesitation. He was standing just behind her, his figure framed by the low glow of the firelight, his expression unreadable. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice hoarse. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt unbearable. Kawea nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It is. They are coming, all of them. Elias, his men, and those within our own tribe who would see us divided. We must stand together, Clara, or we will fall." Clara swallowed hard, her gaze shifting to the twins, their tiny hands grasping at her sleeve as if sensing the rising tension. How do we fight? How do we fight when there are so many sides, so many enemies, when the war is not just outside but within? Kawea's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "We fight by staying true to who we are, by standing together as one. The Comanches have always fought for the survival of our people, but now we fight for a new future, for the children who will inherit this land, for the legacy we will leave behind. The world is changing. Clara, and your son, the one marked by the Great Spirit, he will lead us through it." The weight of his words settled deep into Clara's chest. The path ahead was no longer about surviving the present. It was about shaping the future, about deciding who they would be in a world that was slipping beyond their control. Her son was at the center of it, but so was she. The future wasn't a thing that could be avoided. It was coming, and they would meet it together. As Kawea turned to lead her back toward the warriors preparing for the final assault, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her mind, but now it was accompanied by something else. Resolve. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. She had the tribe, she had Kawea, and more importantly, she had her children. The sounds of the warriors were growing louder as the camp mobilized. Clara could hear the rhythm of drums in the distance, signaling the start of the war dance. She could feel the vibrations in her bones, the pulse of anticipation that ran through the tribe like a living thing. They were ready, and they would fight with everything they had. The battle that ensued was a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. The outlaws came in full force, their numbers overwhelming, but they were met with the fierce resistance of the Comanches. Arrows flew, horses thundered across the land, and the ground shook with the fury of warriors locked in battle. Clara could feel the fear rise in her chest as she moved with the other women and children to the shelter at the rear of the camp. But there was no hiding this time. The battle was here, her children's future was here, and she would not run. Kawea was at the forefront of the fight, his blade flashing as he led his warriors with the precision of a man who had been through this too many times to count. Clara watched him, her heart racing with both fear and admiration. He fought for them all. He fought for her children. And as the battle raged on, Clara found herself stepping forward. She wasn't a warrior. She didn't have the strength to wield a sword or the skill to shoot an arrow, but she had something else. The fire of a mother's love, the strength that came from the blood in her veins, from the love for her children that could not be extinguished, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Clara moved toward the warriors, stepping into the fray in her own way. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for the future, for her children's future. The battle continued into the late hours of the night. Clara fought in the ways she could, helping the injured, tending to those who needed her, keeping her children safe. Kawea led the charge, his warriors showing no mercy, their strength unyielding. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the battle had finally come to an end. The outlaws had been driven off, their dead and wounded carried away in defeat. But Clara knew this wasn't the end. The war was far from over. As the dust settled, Kawea found her amidst the chaos, his eyes locking with hers across the battlefield. The cost had been high, but they had fought together, and together they had won. "It's not over yet," Kawea said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of everything that had passed. Clara nodded, the gravity of his words settling deep into her bones. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, "but we'll face it together." The storm wasn't over. The future was still uncertain, but Clara had found something that she hadn't had before: purpose, strength, and the unwavering resolve to fight for what was right, for her children, for her people, for the future that would be shaped by their hands. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The battle had been won, but the true war was just beginning, and Clara would be ready.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.